All right, thank you. Welcome to our Zoom call summary of Adventure One. I'm going to call this Race to Port Townsend and Back, and we'll see
Wow.
whether or not that was successful or not. It was 7 days on the water, very experimental. And yeah, I had some questions, as you can see, for this adventure. First of all, can a fireball dinghy work as a sliding seat rowboat? We'll see how that went. Question two, can I make it to the Blazer party for the race to Alaska at Port Townsend? Spoiler alert, I did not make it. Question three, will the boat sink out from under me? This was not at all clear whether this was going to work. And so we'll see how that goes. Um, for a bit of context, this is the scene. Galiano Island is here. I know a number of you have been here before. If you don't live here, Mark, you're invited. Galiano sits about halfway between Vancouver and Victoria, BC, and it's where we call home. I've been following Race to Alaska for a long time. I'm super interested in getting involved in one way or another. These are the Gulf Islands in Canada. These are Washington State's San Juan Islands. And the Race to Alaska folks were organizing a party. They have it every year. It's called the Blazer Party, named after what people wear to it, the racers anyway. Port Townsend, Washington is just down here, right? So the San Juans are really close, it turns out. Like we often go into Victoria and back, and we're covering longer distances when we do that than the distance that we need to get to the San Juans. And yet the San Juans are a world away to us. So this was kind of a high adventure for me personally anyway, to cross into the US border under my own steam, as it were, because the main rule with Race to Alaska boats is that you can't have an engine aboard. Now, Race to Alaska is in June every year. This adventure was my dipping my toe in the waters, as it were, to try out some systems to get the ball rolling and to get things started. So this will be the scene of the adventure that is about to unfold. I've got some pictures and some video and some slides just to capture how all of this holds together. Michael, our friends Michael, Lorelei, Tobe is a volunteer from here, and Snoopy, our puppy, came along at the beginning of the trip. And so here's a video of the departure. Whoops, I'm going to stop this audio. There we go. Just to set the scene more or less. This is what it looked like, right? And I'll tell you, I'm definitely not used to leaving a port with an audience of anybody to come down and see the departure. That was pretty interesting. The psychological effect it has, a bit nerve-wracking in a way, even. Like it feels like you're putting on a show, you know? But this is the scene, and this was 3 o'clock the day that I was leaving. And I had hoped to leave a lot earlier. You know how it is with getting trips together and getting going. Well, this is quite a bit late for a departure. And this is some of the only footage I've got of the boat in action with the sail up from any distance at all. So maybe that gives you a perspective on the kind of boat that I was using for this. That is a Fireball sailing dinghy designed in the 50s. This one's constructed probably in the 80s or 70s or something like that. It's fiberglass boat, planing hull, about 350 pounds. Right. And so here is a summary slide of what day one looked like. I'm going to show a summary slide like this for all of the days of the trip. It was a 7-day trip in the end. And the theme of day one is that this was the biggest risk, right? Was this thing going to work at all? You know, how much trouble was I going to get into? I was going to find out pretty soon. This was certainly the first voyage that this boat had ever been on in its form. I ended up making it about 8.1 nautical miles to Hope Bay, Pender Island, which is just sort of across the mouth of Active Pass and past Main Island through Captain's Passage. We'll see some footage of this trip. There was a porpoise sighting. At first I thought they were whales. Turns out they were porpoises, which you can tell from the video after the fact. One of the things that became immediately clear was that when you have no engine, you can hear the wildlife. And this is so great. I think that having this kind of a platform, of a boat, I think is going to be a great way to go out and do biodiversity surveys and just to go out and take photographs and videos of things, to just get out on the water and do it this way. And it's so nice to not have an engine going the whole time that you're doing something like that. So that was one thing that I learned straight away. Next up, let's take a look at some of the pictures of that part of the trip. These are the oars. These oars come from Janice and Ian at Lightboat. Janice and Ian are Team Oracle in Race to Alaska, and they've been in it a number of times in a number of modes: rowing, kayaking, sailing, all of the above. They're a great inspiration, and I really have enjoyed watching them in the race over the years. A few weeks prior, I had gone to Salt Spring to collect these oars from them, and they have turned out to be fabulous. So I've now bought the oars, and we're going to be using them for a bunch of experiments to try to get this boat to go faster, as it were. And so this is the first photograph of the trip of the first leg. And here we are heading off. You can see Main Island in the distance here. And so we're basically headed for the pass between Main Island and Pender over that way. Welcome, Shannon. Thanks for dropping in. All right, so next up, hitting some kelp along the way. This was a little bit close to Prevost Island. This kelp is going to be a bit of a theme later on. Super great to run into kelp forests. This one was drifting out a little bit out in the middle of nowhere. Here is a video for a bit of context of what it's like to be aboard the boat. It was really great to get some sailing in on this first day. It turns out that over the whole trip, it was probably 85% rowing and 15% sailing, right? Over the course of 7 days. The sail on board the boat is not the rig that's intended for one of these boats. This is a much smaller sail. I was being extra cautious because this boat is really designed for 2 adults, where one adult is hanging out off the boat entirely, hanging on the end of a trapeze. And that was not going to be me on this trip. So I'm effectively permanently reefed with a smaller sail for the whole trip. And so this slide, which shows a screen grab from the navigation software, Navionics, is one of those moments where you're like, okay, I'm going to wait for the boat to be going as fast as I possibly can be going, and then I'm going to take this screenshot, right? It's like the peak speed that you never see for the rest of the day. This is, in fact, one of the fastest moments for the whole trip. And I happened to grab it on the phone because look at the time on this, 5:42 p.m. And the very next snapshot, 5 minutes later, half the speed. This is much more typical of what ended up happening for most of the trip. Okay, and so a bit more video for a bit more context. Notice where the oars are. They're stored across the boat. This is not where they would end up staying for most of the trip. This is me experimenting with things. Here is the first sighting of any major wildlife. This is the porpoise sighting that day. And I managed to get a bit of video. one of the lessons learned for this trip is how to do this part, how to do the video and photographs and stuff. And I've learned since how to use the accessibility settings on an iPhone so that I can do hands-free voice activation controlled of taking the photographs and switching between apps and stuff like that. Because when you're rowing and sailing, the last thing you need to do is to stop to run the gear that you're running. So that'll be an improvement for adventure number 2, which we'll talk about a little bit later. More photos. We'll just get through this stuff a little bit quicker. Here's a snapshot of my arrival. I arrived at port at Hope Bay on Pender Island in the dark, which it turns out is going to be a major theme of this whole thing, and a major lesson learned. And basically, we've got some stuff to do in order to make things better. Arriving in the dark sucks. It's stressful. More on that later. These were the sleeping arrangements that night. Slept on the dock. It was cold. More lessons learned. Yeah. Let's see here. In fact, this is in the morning, the next morning. 5:45 a.m. sunrise light. There's the boat tied along the dock. I've taken the boat apart because truthfully, you've heard of the parable of people building an aircraft while it's flying. That was kind of what this trip was like, especially in the first 3 or 4 days. I was not sparing weight. I brought a lot of weight on board with me, mostly in the form of wood and tools and drills and cases of tools that I needed to be able to fix and improve things as I was going. Kind of adventurous that way. So here we are, Hope Bay, and the departure the next day. So back to here. Here's the summary for day 2. Now, the map is zoomed quite a bit farther out. And remember, my mission here at this point is to try to make it to Port Townsend as fast as I can get there, right? This day was 14 hours, mostly rowing. 20.1 nautical miles is as far as I was able to make it in the day. Made it down to Friday Harbour on San Juan Island. Some highlights of this day was a border crossing into the United States and the nighttime arrival, again, a nighttime arrival. Yeah, and by the way, for the rest of this presentation and talk and chit chat and discussion, I'm highly interruptible. So if you've got any questions about anything that comes up, please just stop me. Or I'm also following along the chat. This is feeling a lot like my my day job, which is to do Zoom meetings for students, right? So anyway, just feel free to jump in at any point. That's day 2. Now on to some pictures from day 2 just to see what's going on. There's a beginning and a middle and an end. You know, any good journey has 3 parts. The road down between Pender and Saturna was pretty nice. By the time I got to the south end of Pender, and I'm now facing the crossing into the United States, I've used an app on the phone called CPB Rome, something like that. That's an app that's built for crossing the border. And so I connect with it. I have a video chat with one of the border guards, and he explains to me a little bit more about the process than I was able to get from the website. Basically, I needed to be in US waters first before that went on. And he wanted the boat to be registered. Now, this is just a sailing dinghy. Imagine you're in a kayak. Is your boat registered? Not likely, right? So I got off the video chat with them. He was insisting that I find a hull number or some form of number that can be identified to the boat. I scoured it, couldn't find one. What I ended up doing was, so here's a video that provides a bit of context of what it's like while I'm on the video chat app with the border crossing folks. Just trying to get myself sorted out. By the way, running this boat so far is a lot like playing a game of Twister, where you're trying to figure out where to put your feet, right? Because it was a relatively delicate rowing setup. and needed to be made a little bit more bomb-proof, right? So not able to find a serial number or any form of registration number, what I did do was manage to lean over the back of the transom with a Sharpie and write a serial number on the hull. And there, that's now my hull number, which I took a photograph of and submitted on my next phone call after I entered US waters, because it was part of the process that needed to happen. So there you go. That is me getting ready to go into US waters. And I think by here I'm finally in US waters. There's shipping traffic in the lanes to try to make this work. And the good news is they let me into the US. This was actually one of the more seamless border crossings that I'd done up to this point in recent memory. Just get them on the app, have a nice video chat. They wanted to know, like, what the heck am I doing? But other than that, they were fine. And in I go. I learned basically that if things go fine through that app, when you're connecting and when you're having your chat with them and whatever, because they can see you through the camera that you've got on the app, is that you may or may not be asked to go into a port of call. And in this case, they did not ask me to go into a port of call. That would have been Friday Harbor, which is where I was headed anyway, but it was going to take me a very long time before I got there, right? More on that border crossing sort of stuff later. But after this conversation, they're like, yeah, you can go to any one of the places now. You're all good. Okay. I believe it's Rosemary Georgeson tells a story about how a bee comes to land on a boat that she's on when she was a kid. Same thing happened here. I'm out in the middle of nowhere. This was like a wasp that was transiting between islands, and you just sort of came in for a bit of a rest and hung out with me for a bit before taking off to the next island. And there were certainly times in the middle of all of this transiting, moving around, whatnot, where I was losing time because I was not particularly good at running the boat at this point. In particular, things like transitioning between rowing mode and sailing mode took me about 20 minutes. Later, by the later stages of the trip, I was able to whittle that down to less than 5. And I expect to be able to do much better. More on that later. Yeah, so here we are trying to make it into Friday Harbor. This is kind of what the scene was like. Notice, not a lot of wind. This is going to be like this for the majority of the trip, in fact. So, yeah, there's video. I'll share the directory if you want to go in and look at these videos and pictures for yourselves later at any point. I'm taking snapshots as I go from time to time in the Navionics app, just so I can see where I am and keeping records. These photographs ended up being my best estimates of keeping a record of how far I had made it. I'm going to be developing a better system based on lessons learned here for performance tracking. Oh, by the way, one thing that you will not see a lot of in any of this description of this trip is speed. This turned out to be an extremely slow trip. A lot of lessons learned along the way. So here I am by 7 p.m. I've been on the water for 10 hours or so by now, mostly rowing, right? But you can see we're getting there. Are we there yet? Yeah, not yet. Okay. Yeah, more of the same. Still trying to make it down to Friday Harbor. Okay, and this is the next morning. So let's go back to the slides. Day 3, end of day 2 was a night arrival. That was super stressful. Tons of lessons learned. Happy to share more about that later. Patty asks, were there strong currents that you had to navigate to go in the direction you wanted? From time to time, yes, absolutely. Certainly more stories about that coming up. But for context, at any given point, like let's check in with right now, for example. Actually, you know what? It's not in this version of the app because this is online currently, but the currents might be 1.5 or 2 knots, sometimes 3 or higher in some places, but that's approximately how fast I can go, or how fast I was going in this case. So there you go. Those currents are in some cases like completely stopping me. More on that next or soon. So for Friday Harbor, arriving at night, here's where I end up the next morning. Slept on the dock, socked in with fog. Now, at this point, I'm still trying to make it to Port Townsend. And this fog was extremely daunting. You could hear large ferries and big vessels blowing their horns in the fog to like basically be a warning, hey, don't come here, right? I took this time after a huge major day yesterday of 14 hours, basically rowing most of the time for a 20 nautical mile journey to get to Friday Harbor. I'm like, you know what? This fog is a signal. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to work on the boat, fix it a bit, move my gear around a bit, try to get a bit better with that sort of stuff. And so that's what the morning turned into. Here's me starting to take things apart, doing a bit of planning, right? Again, with the Tetris slash Twister game that this boat is, here it is all sort of played out on the dock. This sort of scene would, I mean, most everybody who walked by would strike up a conversation, right? What are you doing? Why? Yeah, definitely, Ian. Time to do some yoga. Yep. uh, yeah, this was an opportunity to learn the kind of shape I need to get into, right? Um, but I did spend a fair bit of time this morning, basically redoing how the sliding seat rowing setup was bolted into the boat. I remember Michael and Lorelei leaving for Montague, and Michael was very kind in not describing just how fragile and terrible my setup was. I know that he probably wanted to say something, and I know that he bit his tongue at that point. So thank you, Michael, for that. This is very much better than what I had just the day before in terms of how the sliding seat rowing system was set up. Again, now I've got that whole thing torn out, and we're going to do version 2.0 coming up next with lessons learned. But there we go. You may have seen this picture associated with the event. This is Friday Harbor in the fog, still trying and hoping to make it down to Port Townsend. There's a bit of planning, trying to get going. And now the fog has just started to lift. After my departure, I left around 10:30 or 10 o'clock in the morning, something like that. And I'm heading out into fog that's just starting to lift. Okay. Also a bit of sailing here. And then this is the fog bank, the last bits of it. And this island is called Turn Island. And this was my first peek around the corner. The Juan de Fuca is down out here somewhere, just around the corner. And in the fog and struggling with getting the boat moving, you kind of lose your orientation from time to time, right? Like you're not really sure where things are. The first time you've ever been to a place, it's a, there's personal exploration that's going on here, right? One thing that's happening is that the current, given what Patty had asked earlier, is completely against me. There's absolutely no way I'm ever going to make it around this corner until that current has switched, till we've gone through a slack tide, and now we're going to have that current going in the right direction. I was surprised at how much current there was everywhere, right? So living on Galiano, we're used to Active Pass and Porlier Pass in the north. And the currents in those passes can get up above like sometimes 5-6 knots for Active Pass, 7 or 8 knots for Porlier Pass. And we're used to thinking of those places as the place where the dangerous currents are. But when all you can do is 2.5 knots rowing, it becomes the dominant thing, right? So Turn Island here, this is the south end of San Juan Island. Turn Island was my adventure outfit to learn for the next hour and a half. I ended up over top of a kelp forest next to Turn Island. And this is an extremely brief video. I promise to get better at taking these videos in real time while I'm struggling with the things around me, where I'm pointing out how sitting over this kelp forest, the kelp forests, by the way, are great for just doing immediate checks on where the current is and how much it's flowing, right? How I'm tucked away on a back eddy. That's how I've managed to get in next to Turn Island. And I wish I had better video of the wall of water that is coming around this island in this direction. So as soon as I would try to get out into this, I would start floating back the other way, basically needing to wait for the turns. And that's about all of the video I got for that section. But I remember what it was like to have your boat like turning around in a back eddy and not having a lot of control of it. More on that later when we see Turn Island again later on. So the turn did come eventually. Now you can see here on the Navionics app that now the current's actually going my way and it's going to start building. And I've started to sail down toward this channel, which is in fact the entrance to the Juan de Fuca Strait, which would be a big crossing to get over to Port Townsend. So more of that, a little bit more distance covered. This is the Sailflow app, checking out the wind levels that I'm seeing. I don't believe these for a second, because you're about to see the wind in a minute. There is no way that 4 and 3 and 5 knots is what's going on. There's something going on with the sensors. Let's check it out, what this actually looks like in person. This is a video of some of the best sailing in the whole trip. And this is what it's like to sail this boat. I'm going to say it's about 10 knots blowing at this point. And you can see I've found some nicer places for the oars to sit, right? The Tetris has gone a little bit better from previous things. You can see the setup of the oar locks, right? And how they're sort of designed and put together there. It gives you a bit of perspective of what it was like to sail this boat around. Here's another one, bit larger screen this time. I'll turn off the audio. You can watch these later anytime, of course. Yeah, so this was super exciting, right? I'm still trying to get to Port Townsend. I'm in the wind. There's a few white caps around here and there, right? I've just gone through 2.5 days of really just pushing hard and trying to get to where I'm going, learning about the boat, learning how it's set up and whatnot. And I get to the point where I can tell that there is no way I'm going to be able to make it to Port Townsend on time for this party. I'm not feeling super confident about the boat, right? There are times when I'm like having to screw nuts back on to make sure that things stay held together. This was the place that I had to make the call. And it was like, you know what? I want to take this easy. I want to work on the boat itself, work on my systems and all of that. But what I will say is that this was super fun, this part. So while I'm making this sort of, heart-crushing decision to not continue on with the mission, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to focus on what I need to focus on, which is getting the boat in better shape, learning how to sail it in higher winds than this, and bigger waves than this. That's what's coming next in adventures 2 through 7 or 8 or so coming up. So that's an example of sailing it in that level of wind. Here I am, having made the decision to turn around and go back, and now I'm going downwind, which is so much of a pleasure to do when you're sailing. Sailing downwind is kind of what people work toward when you're, say, in a race or any of that sort of stuff. This was just a beautiful, beautiful half hour's worth or so of sailing, champagne sailing, super smooth, nice and downwind. You can see the waves going by. You can see the approximate speed that I've got. I clocked it in here at about 5 knots over the water, which is not crazy fast. But again, I'm using a really small sail for this boat. So the rig is not designed to go fast. It was designed to be safer, more or less. But I tell you what, this was a lot of fun. And if any of you are at all inclined, I would like to invite you to come along with me at some point when I've got the systems a little bit better locked down. Yeah? All right. So there I am taking my speed measurement from that location, headed back towards Turn Island here. And more videos for more context. Basically, me commiserating with myself having failed in the mission of getting to the Port Townsend Blazer Party for Race to Alaska, and instead congratulating myself for making the better decisions around safety. Because now I have 3, 4, 5 or so days going back to Galiano where I get to do all sorts of shakedown stuff. And that's a big change of how this mission was going to go from here. A little bit more video captured of that. And now I start planning of what the rest of the trip is going to look like. And I want to talk about a couple of things that I found out in my research in the middle of this planning on the trip back. First up, there is this organization in Washington State that does a marine trail. And so a marine trail in Washington State looks about like this. It's basically a bunch of places where kayakers especially are welcomed. They're encouraged to go. That's what the whole organization was set up for. And in finding this became a lot of valuable information for me about how am I going to get home now? What kind of sail camping rowing am I going to do? In my, interacting with this organization's website, I decided, you know what? I'm going to go there eventually. And then I ended up also going to this place. I considered Stewart Island briefly for a while. A lot of these decisions about where to stay are affected by, okay, how am I going to get back into Canada? And when is that going to happen? And so on. So I definitely encourage people to check out the Washington Marine Trail organization and to look into the kinds of things that you can find out about each of the places that you could pull into using your kayak or small sailboat or whatever, that kind of thing. So that kind of research was going on for a bit. Here's a picture from Friday Harbor itself. Let's go back to our slides. So this is what day 3 looked like. Me at first trying to get down to Port Townsend and then basically pulling the plug on this journey and saying, you know what, I'm going to take my time, head back. That's the agony of defeat here. And then, you know what, it's not so bad sailing downwind from time to time and having a bit of fun with sailing like that. So that's day 3. I'm feeling this quote from Michael Jordan about successes and failures. I did see this as a failure, but an important failure for me. Here's what did happen at Port Townsend. Speaking of Race to Alaska stuff, I'm going to bring this up and I'm going to paste this link into the chat because maybe you haven't been following along with Race to Alaska stuff. I'm going to paste it into the Zoom chat. I would encourage you to watch this if you haven't so far. It's basically Race to Alaska's announcement that for the next iteration of the race, everybody has to go through the inside passage. They're not going to allow racers to go around the outside of Vancouver Island on their way north. And I think it's just basically deciding what is going to be the character of this race going forward. Yeah. So check that link out, which I put in the chat for now. And then we can start to turn our minds toward what day 4 was going to turn into. You may notice that my previous day 2 of 20 nautical miles in 14 hours, and then day 3 of just like trying to get to Port Townsend and then figuring out that it wasn't going to work, that was a lot of me trying really hard to get south. Day 4, I've given up on that entirely, right? It's time for a day that's a little bit more gentle, right? 7 nautical miles in 8.5 hours. This is the approximate path of how that looks. And basically, I head from Friday Harbor on San Juan Island over to the Jones Island Park campsite and dock. And so that's going to be the theme of today, a bunch of experiments. So let's take a look into some of that. Took this picture for Martine, who's been collecting pallet wood lately. There was a bunch of pallets that were freely available in Friday Harbor. This is a video of the Friday Harbor marina and harbor, where I'm describing how if you stay in Friday Harbor for 4 nights, the 5th night is free. Didn't know that. The folks at Friday Harbor are really cool. It's a really cool town. It's kind of industrial. It's the port where people go when you're trying to clear customs, if you have to do that in person. But there are plenty of reasons to stop in here. I ended up staying at a hotel that night, 2 nights at a dock, literally sleeping on a dock was plenty for me by that point. So that was nice. Went to get some decent food, a bit of a grocery store trip, that type of stuff. Also pulled into the hardware store for some much needed repairs on the boat. Picked up a solar panel as a gift for Martine and her kayaking trips. Also picked up an anchor because there was certainly moments when I was hoping to have an anchor around and didn't have it on the way down. I'm like, okay, you know what? That's obviously super important safety gear. This is a video of part of the first part of the trip up to Jones Island. I'm taking a video of a deadhead because deadheads are going to be a strong theme to these adventures and research developments going forward, especially when you're trying to go fast. Deadheads are your enemy. You don't want to hit these things. You don't want to hit them at night. You don't want to hit them in the day. This is starting to feel like a Dr. Seuss poem. Those are not good. More planning around Jones Island stuff. Okay. Next, let's do a bit of a theme chat talk on tide lines and current division lines. What's happened here is I've run across a tide line. I've ended up nearby a bunch of flotsam, right? And so the tide line is a place where you've got currents going one way, currents going another way. And the sea gathers seaweed and logs and whatever else happens to be floating around, like slow boats like mine, and we end up all together at these tide lines, right? And so basically I've ended up sort of stuck here between 2 areas of water that are in fact moving in different directions. So for example, here is a video where I describe figuring out how to interpret the tide lines that you run nearby, right? And notice, for example, these little circular pods of flotsam are in fact rotating. And along this tide line, these rotating flotsam piles are all rotating the same direction. This one is a counterclockwise tide line that I'm in. And so the side that I'm on, the current is going from left to right, as you see it in the video. And if I was trying to go the other way, I should be on the other side of this tide line because that's where the favorable current is, right? Basically makes these little spirals as you go. So that was super interesting to observe. Of course, lots of great scenery, lots of really beautiful houses along the shorelines. This is more planning from me. You can see the currents against me here. And then a video where I think that was my video with Toots, actually. I was trying to have a conversation with him through videos. More Tetris, more Twister. And it gets to this point where through my experiments with rowing and sailing, I figured out how to row and sail at the same time. And let me tell you, that is a huge step forward in the how to run this program. Again, not a lot of wind here, right? and I'm only rowing on one side. You can see I've got a rope that's set up to be able to steer and move the tiller around, right? So I'm steering with one hand, rowing with the other, taking a video with my third arm. I don't know, right? It was just kind of like that a lot. And I'm not moving that fast. You can see the bubbles in the water, leaving a little tiny bit of wake, right? But there's a lot of juggling going on here. I feel like and in fact, the whole journey was like this. You know, the performances where people are spinning plates on sticks, right? And you're running around trying to keep the plates all up. That's a lot what it feels like running this boat. In fact, what happens next in this journey is something I will not forget and was a huge lesson. Everything was going really well. This was like a bit of a high, right, compared to disappointments of the past part of the journey. And what happened almost as soon as I turned this video off is the phone goes overboard into the water. Now,
Oh,
yeah, the phone is in a waterproof case and it's charging plugged into that solar panel. The charging cable unplugged. And so as the phone goes overboard, the charging cable caught on this oarlock mechanism. Can I get a good shot of the oarlock mechanism? I'm not sure if I can. That thing right there. So the cord on the phone is dangling by this cord and it's in the water and the boat's moving about 2 knots. And you know when you plug your phone in and you hang it by the cord and it's just barely hanging on? That's what was happening to the phone. The cord luckily tangled in this oarlock thing, and I never had reached across to grab something faster before, because that phone is the dominant kind of my communication. It's also the navigation stuff. This was disaster averted, and yeah, learned a lot of lessons. Things got better from that point of view going forward, and you can imagine that my setup for this in the future is going to be way more locked down for that in particular. Okay, so here's some navigation stuff. Again, heading up to the park. It's 8:21 at night. By now, I've actually had a conversation with somebody who also happened to be out rowing around sunset. They were from Orcas Island. That was kind of fun, right? Just running into people out on the marine trail. 8:21 p.m. It's really starting to get dark by now. And again, I'm kind of over arriving at a place in the dark if it's not part of the plan. This was where I showed up. Ended up needing to tie the boat under a gangway. And I ended up sleeping on this dock. I probably got 2 hours of sleep that night. It was a bit cold, right? Lessons learned there. More on that later. Met some really great folks on that island park. And we toured around the island in the morning. It took like an hour. They fed me breakfast. Super kind. It's nice to exchange stories with people and to meet them in these contexts. It's super fun. Super fun, you know? That was that kayak trip. The kayak group later left from Jones Island Park and was headed south towards Orcas Island. Took that photograph. There were deer on that island. Really great place to visit. Highly recommended. And this is the beginning now of the next day. So day 4 was to Jones Harbour. Here's day 5, the summary. Today, for day 5 out of 7, again, not a super aggressive day in terms of trying to make a bunch of yards and distance and miles and whatnot. More like being a tourist and exploring around. This is the Jones Island Park. Here I'm headed for Roche Harbour, which turned out to be a really great destination. Lots to show about that. But I ended up staying on Posey Island Park, which is something to be introduced to here. And you'll see more about Posey Island Park coming up. So, let's take a look at the navs, by the way. This is me sailing along at 2.6 knots. This is day 5. I had not yet ever taken any water over the bow in this whole trip. Not a lot of wind, mind you, right? Maybe the 10 knots that we saw in that bay between San Juan and Lopez. But there were much higher winds during this time going across here, again with a smaller sail. I don't think I cleared much over 2 or 3 knots, frankly, with that sail setup. But right around in this section, I ended up taking 3 or 4 waves where I got a little bit of water over the bow and then draining into the cockpit. So boat wakes, it turns out, are some of the best opportunities to practice in bigger waves, right? Some boats leave huge wakes. And by this point in the trip, I'm actually a lot more confident in the boat's ability to take waves. And so I'm, not as stressed out as I was about it earlier on in the trip. That's for sure. Okay. This is my first real exposure to a thing that I'm going to call the tidal treadmill. So this is a current, right? 2.8 knots against the direction that I'm trying to go in. And here's what happens when you get into a channel and you're going approximately the same speed of the current. Your boat will find the point in the passage that's where the water is going exactly the same speed as you, and there you will stay, right? And so I'm rowing harder, rowing as hard as I can and going nowhere, right? That is completely disheartening, right? I was surprised at how much current there was in the passages that are going east to west, right? There's broad water flow across the whole region up into the Strait of Georgia and then draining from the Strait of Georgia down through this area. When a passage is directly east to west, it's not immediately obvious when and how much it's going to have currents that are in sync or not in sync with the overall flow of current north and south, right? So there's a bit of complexity there to unfold. What I ended up doing was pulling into this harbor, which is really lovely, really well placed for a bit of a rest. Had a snack, got my shit together, frankly, halfway through this day trip to Roche Harbor. Here we are, arrived at Roche Harbor. I took this photo for the irony, right? Here I am in a boat with no engine, and this is fuel dock only. It's where I show up. I think, in fact, the fuel dock is where you go when you want to, get the news, chat with people, figure out the lay of the land in a new port or whatnot. These are a bit of planning screenshots that I took from the phone as I was going. I almost never take images of food that I'm eating, but man, I was hungry by that point. Here's just a photograph of a boat. Turns out this is the kind of boat that we had when I was a kid. So I was pretty keen to take a picture of it because it reminded me of when I was 10 years old. Bit more planning, trying to figure out where I'm going to stay. Am I going to stay in Roche Harbor? Turns out this is a taxi ride to get to a campsite that's actually driving like halfway back to Friday Harbor. Didn't eventually do that. Now I'm researching Posey Island State Park, which is where I end up to decide, I'm doing camping on this trip. I'm going to do some camping tonight. I'm going to investigate what that looks like, thanks to the Marine Trail in Washington State. A few more photographs around Roche Harbor. And then this is a really short video from Posey Island. I want to take you to the next one. I wish I had the time to say more about Roche Harbor, by the way. It's a pretty cool spot to pull in. This is Posey Island State Park. It's a super small island. In that pan of that view, you've seen half the island, right? It's a super cute spot to pull into. A couple of campsites, a few picnic tables, and it turns out that you can reserve it. So you can go on a website and say, you know what, I want to have that campsite for me. I love this sign because they can't come out and say kayaks, can they? Right? But really, that's what this is for. This is the Marine Trail, human-powered beachable watercraft only. Okay, I qualify, right? There's my human-powered beachable watercraft, right? I bet they didn't have that in mind when they were making the sign up. But yeah, that's what that island is all about. And it's just a super neat destination. Definitely worth taking a look. I decided to take a video of this posted note, which shows the names of the people and the dates that they've got the island campsites reserved for, right? And I happened to show up on September 10th, and that's it. The island was mine. This is me the night before. Turns out a bunch of Canada geese showed up, first I'd seen for the season. And a few words about that point. This is high tide, and this is where you want to put your boat. We're going to see why. I stayed in my Hennessy hammock overnight here. Got up the next day to a much better wind forecast, planning my trip over to Canada now, getting started. And I knew that the tide was going out. What I didn't know was that I was going to sleep in that hammock. And I woke up 3 or 4 hours late. You know, it's been a tiring trip up to this point. And my boat was left much higher and drier than I wanted it to be. So I'm like, okay, I need to figure out how to get this 350-pound boat down to the water. And I decide, okay, I'm going to take a time-lapse video of this process. Yeah. Turns out the time-lapse filled my phone, and so I only got 13 seconds of it. But here's me trying to figure out how to move this boat down to the water's edge before the phone runs out of juice or runs out of space. I did come up with a system where I ended up getting more efficient and being able to push it down to the water's edge. Here's the proof where I had moved the boat finally down to the water's edge. Took me a while, and I ended up launching at the very lowest of low tides. Here's part of the system of how to pull that all together. Here's a little bit more about Posey Island. For future reference, here's a nice video of that place at very low tide. This is where you want to put your boat, because that would have been a much easier launch than what I had to do over here. Yeah, fair enough. Future reference. Here's me planning my trip back into Canada on day 6. I was, for the research that I had been given, and by the way, the Canada Border Services website is terrible. Perhaps that's no surprise. No park bench was injured during the time lapse. Turns out you do not need necessarily to go to Sydney when you are clearing border customs to get into Canada. In fact, there are dozens of ports that you can pull into that are considered open ports. And it took a 20-minute phone conversation with somebody from Hamilton, Ontario, who had to look through a database of places that I could go. I learned that, having entered Canadian waters here, that I could have the whole time been heading straight toward Pender. Lesson learned. I now know how to cross the border much better. This is me planning my trip over to Sydney on day 6. Here's a bit of video for what the weather was like. Again, not a lot of wind. Current was against or with me to start, not a huge factor. Basically just showing what the water was like. Here's a video of me interacting with, can we hear this? I don't think you can hear it. Later on in the video, there's actually more radio chatter from the VHF, where I learned about an organization called Sound Watch out of Puget Sound, and they were warning a particular vessel that they were about to come upon the southern resident killer whale pod, and do they know the rules, and that you have to stay 400 meters away, and they had the whole conversation with them over the radio, and it was really great. I think it would be great if we could have a similar kind of organization here in Canada. More on that later. Here's a photo of the last point of the United States that I'm able to see as I'm about to cross that channel back over toward Pender. Again, a little bit of video about that. Let's see, 20 seconds, not worth it. Yep, got a bit of sun. Here's my arrival in Bedwell Harbour, Pender. And yeah, I was super happy to have found a place that I'm like legally allowed to pull in. As long as I had gotten there before 8 o'clock, then I was allowed to go there. Otherwise, I needed to go somewhere else. So timing is obviously pretty important. There's the Border Services place in Bedwell Harbor, right next to Poets Cove Resort, by the way, where we pull in for more pictures of food and then a bit more event planning after that. Okay, so this is actually day 7. And day 7, the last day, turns out to be quite an adventure. Day 7 starts out in Bedwell Harbor, and I'm headed for Montague. And I remember that morning, the current was largely going to be going with me. And I thought, you know what? That's great. Whatever route I take, the current is going to be going with me, going in my direction. I've got 2 options for this day. One is to hop out just a quick 20-minute row back south and get out into the main channel where most of the ferry traffic goes from Swartz Bay back up towards the Gulf Islands, and just take this trip up very direct, current with me the whole way, maybe get a bit of extra wind out there. And then I thought, you know what? The other trip is going to be way more interesting and engaging for this final day, right? So I could go that way instead, including, for example, going under the bridge between North and South Pender, right? Super cool spot. I'd never been through under that bridge before in the past. I thought, okay, you know what? This is my opportunity. How often do I get by this way? I'm going to take the inside side instead of this outside side. Was that a mistake? I think so. We'll see why as this unfolds. Here I am getting ready to go through that pass between North and South Pender. You know, red right returning. Here's the green navigation marker. Here's the red navigation marker. That is, in fact, the pass between North and South Pender. Not a lot of space between them there. Yeah. There's a navionics grab of that moment. By the time I did get to the bridge between North and South Pender, there was a fishing boat coming the other way. That was exciting. Bit of dodging traffic doing that. Then I get through. Okay, a big theme of this trip was improving my operations. I'm going to stop the video here. Notice now I've got a snatch block attaching my main sheet to this sail. So for those of you who aren't sailors, the main challenge for me here was switching back and forth between rowing mode and sailing mode, right? By now, I've figured out that I need to be able to remove this main sheet from this boom really quickly. And now I've got a piece of hardware that came out of the, the hardware kit that I talked about, the heavy one. Now I'm able to remove the main sheet from this part of the boom just really fast by removing it that quickly. And so going forward, that is the way that I'm going to be attaching sheets to booms and masts and stuff, something that I can just really quickly click on and click off to remove it. I'm basically taking a video here to give a bit of a tour to show off what the new setup looks like. Again, there's the way that I'm steering with the rudder, with that line coming between my legs. It's important to be able to control the steering from wherever you are sitting in the boat. This is the pass between Pender and Saturna. Bit of planning, bit of speed measurements and whatnot. Starting to show off here, hanging the hummus out on the oar blade. And I don't know if Mark is still with us, but this was a video that I took for Mark because Mark is super into setting up boats that have what he calls a wingmaran. So that's like a catamaran, but not with floats that float outside, but instead flat surfaces that add riding moment to your sailboat. And I'm like, hey, I could do that with an oar blade, right? And so if I set up some system that's going to hold this oar in place, then watch what would happen here. As the boat leans into the water a bit, you can start to see how the oar blade is going to provide support for the boat and prevent it from going into the water, right? And so there's a bit of like hydrodynamics to watch here and play around with. I think that there are better systems for a wingmaran, and I point you to Mark's designs, in fact. Excuse me, having a little fun here today, right? Okay. Um, remember the tidal treadmill? That's what happened to me between Pender and Main Island. I got into this pass, and yes, the water is largely going south to north because the water is in fact going my way, right? But not so much in this channel. I ended up struggling for a long time to get through here, much longer than I had hoped. And it ended up cutting down on my speed for the day quite a lot. By now, I'm on my game. I'm able to row better than I was before. And yet, for my whole day, I ended up only clocking in 13.6 nautical miles in 10 hours worth of trying to get where I was going. In fact, it was here that I had conversations with Michael, who was passing by on a ferry, and I was not going to be able to see him. Oh, sorry, that was the day before. In fact, what happened here was Martine ended up going by on a ferry, and she just barely could see me through here in this channel because I was so far away from the ferry path. I ended up passing by Village Bay Main Island, took a shot of that. And this was an epic struggle because I arrived late and now the current's going the wrong way. This is active pass. The current through here was about 3 knots, and yet I was still able to cross over the mouth of active pass, even though I had a 3-knot exit current. So I'm actually pretty proud of this. I ended up calling Lynn Marie, who lives right here on Galiano, and there's some really nice shots of me rowing out in the middle of this passage on my last day trying to get home. There's a shot of the next would-be sunset, and then I pulled into Fillmore Point and back to Montague Harbour in the dark again, something that I'm trying to avoid doing. There's one of the photographs that Lynn Marie took of me coming in back to Galiano, like that. And then another photo that I really like because it shows the contrast of what it's like to be in a boat that doesn't have an engine compared to the wake that gets left by an engine on another boat that's moving clearly a lot faster than I had been doing before. Okay, I'm gonna stop that for now. Back to the slides. By the way, just like Washington State has its marine trail organization, so does British Columbia also have its marine trail organization. And I highly recommend checking into the kind of data that people have gathered in campsites and places to pull in off the water along the way. Recently, we had a volunteer here at our place do a kayak trip from the north tip of Galiano all the way up into Howe Sound, kayaked straight across this. This map would have been super helpful to us when we were planning that trip because it would have shown us exact places that he could pull over and pull the kayak up and get a bit of warning about what it's going to be like trying to kayak in that area. But if you look at the area that we live in, there's actually lots of data points here. Seems to me that there's some more data that we could be contributing to this yet. For example, here is Wallis Island, and we could be putting in a data point about that cove, which we've used quite a bit before with kayaking. You know, when the weather's not quite right and not going your way, you want to be able to know a bit about what's going on in there. All right, 2 more slides. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Here are some lessons learned from this whole 7-day trip. 1, water in your boat is a pain if that's where you're storing your gear, right? I ended up bailing out this boat at least every hour, where I would gather about, 3-4 inches of water in the boat because of a leak that I knew was there, and I went anyway. But I figured, you know what? I'll just bail my way all the way up and down. That took a lot of energy and attention. Lesson 2, the small sail was the right one to bring on this trip because I wanted to be cautious with my writing moment and my heeling and leaning over, right? Future trips, I'm going to carry a bigger sail and I'm going to figure out how to reef it well and easily. Lesson 3, beware the tidal treadmills, right? You can burn a lot of energy trying to go through a pass when the current's not going your way. Try to figure out how you can anchor, take a break when you need to take a break. Lesson 4, I need hourly situational awareness checks. My new use of the phone in a hands-free mode where it's voice activated. I'm really looking forward to taking some good biodiversity survey type photos and videos, as well as taking snapshots of the Navionics software in order to keep better track of how things are going performance-wise. Because while there was not a lot of speed going on this particular trip, future adventures are going to be all about trying to add like double and maybe even triple the speed that we were doing on this trip. Lesson 5, tethers and bolting things down, and don't rely on the charging cable on your phone to rescue the day and keep it from falling to the bottom of the ocean. Lesson 6, nav lights, batteries, and recharging. I don't enjoy showing up at a port in the middle of the night, but you want to be ready for that. And that's certainly going to be happening on the next rounds of things. Here's a chart, my net speed while in motion for each day, and the number of hours that were spent on the water for each day down on the x-axis. So you will notice, first 2 days, I'm trying really hard to get there. All I can do on average total is 1.5 knots VMG. That number needs to increase. I'll focus on increasing that number in subsequent adventures. Day 3, I'm already like, this is the day where I decide I'm not going to make it to Port Townsend. You can see in this graph how I am feeling about speed. Only 1 knot VMG on days 4 and 5, where I'm doing a variety of other experiments and trying to improve the boat and get my act together. It wasn't until day 6 that I'm trying again. And then remember day 7 where I made that mistake and ended up on the tidal treadmill again? I feel like I could have had this speed up in the 2 area, perhaps. Again, the boat's carrying a lot of weight that I might not be carrying if I were doing a solo trip. I would have a bigger sail on board with me next time to try to push up above the 2 knot. But I do feel like 2 knots was available to me as a VMG. Yeah. Lesson 7, bring more water and food. A good idea. Thank you in the chat. You know what? There were more lessons than just 7. I'm trying to boil this down into like 1 slide. Yeah. Okay. Here's the pitch. This was Adventure 1, September of 2023. My in-motion velocity made good was about 1.23 knots average. My net velocity, when you include all the camping time and time spent in Roche Harbour and grabbing a shower and staying at a hotel and doing exploring and trying to figure out the borders and all that stuff, my speed clocked in at a blistering 0.5 knot, day in, day out. Okay? Not fast. If I had done no stopping at all, the best I could do for the total average over the 7 days, 1.2 knots. Again, in future adventures, look for these numbers to go quite a bit higher. We'll see how much higher we can make them go. That was the adventure for September. The plan now is to do 1 adventure per month, picking a theme for each of the adventures and trying to add better systems, better camping, better food, deadhead hunting, attaching outriggers to the boat, turning it into a swath vessel, which is a thing that will help with handling much larger and shorter and smaller waves. More on that later. Hydrofoils, again, working on some experiments in the background, trying to figure out how to make this thing turn from 1 into 5, 6 knots. We'll see. Yeah. Next slide. Second last one, I think. Some speeds and some other stats. Here's my adventure with my blistering 0.5 knot. Here is the Race to Alaska solo record. Team Pestu clocked in for a net velocity made good day in, day out over the course of their race of 3.73 knots. So that's the record for an individual trying to make it to Port to Ketchikan as fast as they can. This includes all their camping and all of the stuff. This was done on a trimaran, by the way. And the overall record holder, Team Mad Dog, clock there was a 3-day, 20-hour trip to Alaska. They clocked in, they never stopped anywhere. They just sailed the whole 3 days, 20 hours. Their average speed, 7.7 knots. Yeah. I don't think I'm going to make that with this boat the way that it is right now, but I am going to try to turn this 0.5 into like 1.2, and then from 1.2 somewhere up around 2 or maybe 3 someday. Yeah, that would be nice. It's going to take a lot of engineering to get there, frankly. But what I do hope is that you'll look at this chart and imagine that you yourself might be able to contribute to these further adventures. Maybe we want to be crew. Maybe you want to give me your advice about the next steps, about how to make this happen. Do look forward to better photos and videos, because I'll be able to be more selective about the things, because I'm going to be running it all remotely with a hands-free kind of a mode. And that, my friends, is a wrap. So from here, thank you very much for the time and attention. It did go a bit over time. If you want to hang around and maybe ask some questions or have some fun with it, that's cool. Otherwise, I'm happy to do this again after the next adventure, and maybe we'll be able to report on some improvements in speed and better systems and not needing to bail as much and using bigger sails and stuff like that. So let's leave it at that. Thanks very much, everybody. I'll let people do their thing.
Christian, that was awesome. It's Shannon and Michelle.
Ah, hey, hi. So good. You know what? Let me turn off the recording, then we can speak plainly. Yeah.